Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here. In my career as a foreign correspondent, I went all over the world, but I never made it to Orlando, Florida. So I'm glad to have the chance to do that. Listening to what the people this morning had to say, it's really striking just how enormous the range of problems are that Barack Obama will face. I wanted to add to that list by talking about some of the foreign policy challenges that he will face in Asia, and they are all serious challenges, make no mistake about it. I want to look at several of the issues that I think are the most important in the region and places that I have some personal experience with. And these issues are the rise of China, the North Korean nuclear crisis, and frayed American alliances with Japan and South Korea. Let me start with China. The upshot is that Barack Obama is going to inherit a relationship with China that both governments characterize as better than it's been in a very long time. And that's important because over the long term, I would argue that there's no more important bilateral relationship in the world than the one between the U.S. and China. History has shown, I think, that whenever a dynamic new power seeks a larger international role, tension with the dominant global power is inevitable. And if you look through the history books on more than one occasion, you'll see that it's led to wars. So it's fair to say that for our new president, managing relations with China will be one of the most crucial challenges on his agenda. And there are a host of specific problems and trouble spots in Sino-American relations that the new administration will face. And I want to go through a brief list of them. First, you've got economic and trade issues. You've got the trade deficit. You've got the chronically undervalued Chinese currency, the yuan, which has helped to encourage a surge of cheap Chinese exports to flood Western markets, China's huge holdings of U.S. treasuries, and the consequences of the current financial crisis. You've got a basket of what I would call national security concerns, Beijing's non-transparent military buildup with the defense budget there increasing by double digits every year. There's the concern about keeping the Taiwan issue, which is ultimately the one issue that could see the U.S. and China get involved in a shooting war from blowing up. You've got questions about China's cozy relationships with unsavory regimes from Burma to Sudan to Zimbabwe. And you've got energy and environmental issues. In environmental crisis, China is an environmental disaster area. 16 of the world's 20 most polluted cities are in China. China is now the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Much of this fueled by both the breakneck speed of economic development and China's relentless search for raw materials and oil. You've got internal governance concerns in China, corruption, the issue of the rise of Chinese nationalism. You've got economic issues, the quality and safety of Chinese products, underscored most recently by this huge scandal over the tainted baby milk powder that sickened so many kids in China and raised further doubts about the safety of Chinese goods all over the world. You've got concerns in China about rising unemployment or an economic slowdown, and more broadly, growing inequality in China and the social tensions that that could spark. So all of these issues, I think, are related to sort of three basic broader questions: the way the rise of China will change the global economic and geopolitical order, the question of just how stable China's rise will be over time, and all this leads to the question of how the U.S. needs to deal with a rising China. Before I get into that specifically, because it's so important, I'd like to take a little time to talk about what's happened to China over the past 30-plus years that I've covered the country. My first visit was in 1973. To give you a sense of context and perspective about the scale of the changes, the enormity of the challenges there, and what's at stake for China and for the U.S. As I mentioned, I first visited China in 1973. I saw an isolated, impoverished country still in the grip of radical Maoism. The masses dressed in blue Mao suits, getting around on bicycles, living grim Spartan lives. The dead hand of the communist state controlled virtually every aspect of daily and personal life. People were equal in their poverty and oppression. Fast forward 3 decades, and much of China is unrecognizable. spurred by the exhortation of the late senior leader Deng Xiaoping that to get rich is glorious, China's communist leaders embraced capitalist-style market economics. And the statistics, I think, tell the story of the immensity of this change. The Chinese economy has been growing at an astonishing rate of more than 10% a year for years. China produces 70% of the world's umbrellas, 2/3 of its toys, over half its DVD players, 1/3 of its desktop computers, and 1/4 of its TV sets. Some experts have predicted that if China continues on this track, in 25 years it could have the world's second largest economy. More than 250 million people in China now use the internet. More than 3 times that many have cell phones. By some estimates, 400 million people have been lifted from abject poverty to, in some cases, remarkable wealth. Ordinary Chinese now enjoy a degree of personal freedom, although I should stress that's distinct from political liberty, unprecedented in Chinese history. There is a sizable middle class enjoying a level of affluence from home and car ownership to satellite TV to foreign vacations unimaginable when I made my first visit. It's been a remarkable transformation. In fact, I think it's fair to say that no other society in human history has ever undergone domestic change on such a scale or with the speed that China has experienced. The country has in many respects compressed into one generation the wrenching transformation that Europe and the US underwent in the Industrial Revolution, and that took a century. Which takes us back to these key questions I mentioned. How will China's rise impact the global order? How sustainable is it? Will the internal tensions produced by all the changes slow down growth, spark unrest, or in the most dramatic scenario, lead to the weakening or collapse of Chinese Communist Party rule? And how will the impact of China's changes, whether they continue to succeed or go off the rails, influence China's relations with the US and the rest of the world? Consider issues related to China's transformation into the factory of the world, a boom underpinned by a massive export machine that's fueled the country's rise in recent years. And this is where the current financial crisis is having a major impact. As the slowdown in the US and Europe takes hold, demand from Western consumers for products made in China is slumping, with already devastating consequences. There are reports that in southern China, the heart of the manufacturing boom, this year alone, so far, 67,000 firms have collapsed. Some projections say the total number of companies that could go under in this region by the end of the year could exceed 100,000. Millions of people, mostly folks from the countryside who came to the cities looking for work, are losing their jobs. And it's not just in the factories. Many of these peasants have provided the labor for the construction boom that's transformed the face of China in recent years. That too is slowing down, and these folks will also join the ranks of the unemployed. This is dangerous. With its working-age population still growing, many experts say China must maintain at least an 8% growth rate to maintain its current level of employment. The growth rate for this year, as compared to last year, is expected to be 9%, whereas last year it was 11%, and by next year it may go well below 8%. And in a country with no social safety net, already facing serious internal strains over a growing gap between rich and poor, the booming eastern coast and the impoverished rural hinterland, where hundreds of millions of peasants still live on less than $2 a day, with the system tarnished by rampant corruption and a massive environmental crisis, the prospect of a major economic slowdown could spark major internal tensions. What's so worrying for the leadership in Beijing is that after the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989, the Chinese Communist Party in effect offered the Chinese people a deal. You don't challenge our monopoly on political power, and we'll create the opportunity for you to get rich, or at least to try. If the current circumstances undermine that trade-off, there could be all sorts of worrying implications, especially because these internal strains could impact China's policies on a host of issues important to the US, especially on economic matters. During the campaign, Barack Obama talked tough on trade. He denounced China for undervaluing its currency to artificially pump up exports and promised to use all available measures to press Beijing to alter its foreign exchange policy. Some of that may have been campaign rhetoric necessary to win votes in the economically hard-hit swing states. But with the Democrats in control of Congress and our economy in recession, President-elect Obama could come under strong pressure to make good on his promises to punish China through various retaliatory or protectionist measures. And if the Chinese, for their part, are trying to salvage their own slumping economy by boosting exports, that could be a recipe for real tension. There is, unfortunately, a history of presidential candidates here talking tough on China during the campaign, and then, as they try to implement their campaign promises after taking office, running up against the reality that the U.S. relationship with China is far too complex for such an oversimplified approach. And it's so intertwined, the two countries' ties, that trying to coerce China into changing its policies has the potential to backfire, and that can sometimes hurt U.S. interests. Remember Bill Clinton, in his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention in 1992, he said his administration would not coddle tyrants from Baghdad to Beijing, famous phrase. Clinton promised to get tough on China over human rights, and he did so, or tried to do so, by linking the renewal of China's most favored nation trading status to improvements in human rights. But China's response was not to liberalize, but to crack down more harshly on dissidents, and serious strains developed in the relationship. Eventually, Clinton abandoned the linkage, and ties between the two countries warmed, pressure on dissidents eased, and by the time he made a visit to China in 1998, Clinton was talking about a strategic partnership between Beijing and Washington. But it was a steep learning curve, and I think there is some legitimate concern that President Obama might find himself in a somewhat similar predicament with potential problems for the relationship. Another issue is whether China's domestic problems, and particularly the possible unraveling of the Communist Party's bargain with the people, could raise new questions about the party's legitimacy, which could leave nationalism as the only source of party legitimacy. As we saw last spring in response to Western criticisms of Chinese behavior in Tibet, Chinese nationalism can have an ugly and menacing side. A regime trying to maintain its authority amid growing domestic discontent might well be tempted to play the nationalism card to rally the people behind it, and a more confrontational international posture is often a tempting way to deflect domestic criticism. So the danger for the Communist Party, as Susan Shirk has pointed out in a very good book called China, Fragile Superpower, is that once this nationalist sentiments are stoked, it's not so easy to control them. Modern Chinese history is full of occasions in which angry nationalist feeling shifted from targeting foreigners to targeting governments perceived to be weak on foreigners. In recent years, violent anti-Japanese demonstrations and ugly protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Beijing after the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1998 showed what can happen if things go too far. I've gone into so much detail because the incredible stresses that China faces are often lost in all of the discussions here about how to deal with the country. But it's important to keep them in mind, as they will clearly be shaping the way the Chinese leadership makes many of its decisions, and the way our president will have to handle a rising yet unstable China. Still, despite all these concerns, the picture is by no means all bleak. And as the past few years have shown, the relationship is definitely manageable. Indeed, during this time, in many crucial areas of China's external behavior, the trends have actually been quite positive, as the country has moved to link itself ever more closely to the international system, something I would argue that President Obama should encourage, since the costs of a failed China, I think, are much greater than than any challenge presented by a strong and stable China. And here are some examples of positive steps the Chinese have taken. They've joined the World Trade Organization. They haven't exercised their veto at the UN Security Council. They've engaged in negotiations to resolve long-standing border disputes with many of their neighbors. And apart from Taiwan, China has shown no real indication of aggressive designs on other countries. Moreover, the regime consistently stresses China's interest in a peaceful rise and a stable international environment in which to focus on its top priority, which remains economic growth. So President-elect Obama does have a good deal to work with here, and if the economic tensions can be managed without blowing up into a full-fledged trade war, there are many areas of possible cooperation. Unlike John McCain, who viewed China largely in terms of traditional balance of power, alliance relationships, and conflicts of interest, potential long-term rival that had to be constrained by continued U.S. military buildup in Asia, Barack Obama has talked about the need to work with China in dealing with the new transnational challenges of the 21st century, like climate change, global warming, energy security, global health, and so on. And he's right. On these crucial issues, we do need to work for China. This could, in fact, open up a whole new area for cooperation, with the potential to reshape the U.S.-China relationship in significant and positive ways. One consequence of the generally positive state of the current U.S. relationship with China is that it's helped to calm the broader geopolitical waters in Northeast Asia, from the toning down of previous tensions between China and Japan to Beijing's constructive role on the six-party talks trying to resolve the North Korean nuclear crisis. So let me turn briefly to the nuclear issue. In the past 18 months, there has actually been significant progress on the North Korean nuclear issue. However, the biggest source of near-term tension in Northeast Asia, I think, remains North Korea. As I chronicle in a book that I've just written called Meltdown, the Inside Story of the North Korean Nuclear Crisis, North Korea represents one of the Bush administration's greatest foreign policy failures. When George W. Bush took office, the North Koreans had enough weapons-grade plutonium for one or maybe two nuclear bombs. Operations at the North's Yongbyon nuclear reactor were frozen. As President Bush prepares to leave office, the North has enough material for between 6 to 10 bombs worth of weapons-grade plutonium and has declared itself a nuclear state. The North's nuclear breakout, I believe, was to a large degree a response to the policies of the Bush administration, which pursued an aggressive approach focusing on containing, isolating, sanctioning, and, at least in the eyes of some in the administration, in the best-case scenario, toppling the regime of Kim Jong-il. But the confrontational posture backfired, leading the North not to capitulate to American demands, but instead to strengthen what it calls its nuclear deterrent. Indeed, one of the conclusions from the research I did on my book is that, in general, sanctions and coercion don't work with North Korea. If we push, their standard response is to push back even harder. And that is, I think, what the record of recent years has made clear. The upshot is that today the North Korean nuclear program is more advanced and will be much harder to roll back, if indeed Kim Jong-il is even open to taking such a step. Nonetheless, in the past 2 years, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Christopher Hill, with the backing of Condoleezza Rice, managed to seize control of the policy process, outmaneuver administration hardliners, and move ahead with negotiations that produced key agreements last year. These deals led to North Korea halting operations at its Yongbyon reactor and beginning the process of disabling the facility. A recent crisis, when the North Koreans briefly halted the disabling at Yongbyon and began to resume operations there after the U.S. refused to follow through with its pledge to take the North off of Washington's list of state sponsors of terrorism, was resolved last month. The issue was the administration's insistence that Pyongyang agree to an extremely intrusive set of measures to verify the status of its nuclear program before the U.S. would delist. The North Koreans insisted, correctly, that there was no language in any of the agreements signed last year requiring it to do so. Under a compromise deal reached in October, the U.S. did take the North off the terrorism list, and the North did agree to verification measures for the Yongbyon complex, the site of its plutonium program. But other verification measures will have to be worked out in the next stage of negotiations. Some hardline critics accused the Bush administration of caving into Pyongyang, but this was probably the best deal under the circumstances. It got the process of disabling going again, and that means that Barack Obama, instead of inheriting a major crisis with the North's reactor up and running and producing more weapons-grade plutonium, will inherit a viable, if still extremely complex, diplomatic process. But there's a big question mark, an issue that could well have a major impact on the way the Obama administration deals with North Korea. And that question mark is the health of North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. By all accounts, he had a stroke in mid-August, fueling concern that leadership uncertainty could make North Korea even harder to deal with, especially if the military increases its power during a succession process. The fact that this latest verification deal was reached, however, suggests that Kim Jong-il is still in charge, at least for now, because it's hard to imagine North Korea signing off on the compromise deal reached last month without his okay. But the episode underscores the fact that the issue of succession is now in play, and there's very little clarity about what might happen. By the time his own father was 66, which is Kim Jong-il's current age, the younger Kim had been the designated heir for half a dozen years. But from the publicly available evidence, none of Kim Jong-il's 3 sons from 2 different women have been put forward as his heirs. The oldest one, Kim Jong-nam, is best known for having been detained by Japanese immigration officials at Tokyo airport while traveling on a fake Dominican Republic passport, claiming he was going to visit the Tokyo Disneyland. True story. About the 2 younger ones, almost nothing is known, except they reportedly attended an elite some exclusive boarding school in Switzerland, and one was supposedly seen somewhere in Europe attending an Eric Clapton concert. So there does not appear to be a succession mechanism in place, and President Obama could well face difficult choices about how to try and keep the diplomatic efforts to roll back the North's nuclear program alive at a time of leadership uncertainty and transition in Pyongyang. That will focus new attention on Washington's key alliances in Northeast Asia with Japan and South Korea, which is the next major challenge facing the new administration in Asia. These alliances have played a crucial role in maintaining peace and stability in the region and in projecting American power and influence, but both have been subject to serious strains under the Bush administration. Let me start with Japan. The U.S. decision to take North Korea off the terrorism list has injected a real note of tension into American dealings with Japan. The main reason was the Japanese fixation on the fate of their citizens abducted by North Korean agents in the late 1970s, early 1980s. The Japanese feel that the North Koreans have been unwilling to come clean on exactly what happened to those people, and it's touched a deep chord in Japanese society. Although I think personally it's a bit far-fetched, and I often compare this fixation to the way some Americans were absolutely convinced there were MIAs alive in Indochina after the end of the Vietnam War, when all the evidence pointed in the other direction. But in any case, it's led the Japanese to opt out of providing aid to North Korea promised as the 6-party talks reached the deals last year under which Pyongyang started to disable the Yongbyon nuclear complex. And in Japan, it's fueled doubts about the strength of the security relationship with the United States, a sense that Washington has put making a deal with Pyongyang above taking the feelings of a key ally into account. Beyond the specific issue of the abductees, though, I think Japan has a deeper fear, which is that the U.S. might come to a point, whatever its rhetoric, of accepting a nuclear North Korea. For Japan, with its large population centers well within range of North Korean missiles, that's an existential threat. All this adds new importance to the U.S.-Japan security alliance. It's still the linchpin of Washington's relationship with Tokyo. But Japan confronts a number of key questions about its own security situation. On the one hand, the U.S. complains that Tokyo is not putting enough resources into strengthening the military aspects of the alliance, specifically a missile defense system, a new generation of fighter planes, and the costs of helping the reconfiguration of the U.S. military presence by relocating Marines now based on Okinawa to the island of Guam. On the other hand, some Japanese political figures and strategic analysts worry that the U.S. has been so weakened and distracted by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other concerns that it won't be willing or able to come to Japan's aid in a crisis. And there's also concern in Tokyo that a continuing improvement in U.S. relations with China could come at the expense of Japan. In that so the new president will have a lot of work to do to reassure the Japanese, to calm these troubled waters, keep the alliance on track. In that regard, there were some interesting differences in nuance between the two candidates on how to deal with Japan. Many of John McCain's advisors were associated with the school of thought that's generally linked to the former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, which argues that the U.S. should see Japan as the England of Asia. And many of McCain's advisors didn't hide their view that a close U.S.-Japan alliance would be necessary to counter the rise of China. Obama's advisors, however, while stressing the importance of the alliance, didn't talk in quite those terms. Rather, they talked about the need for the U.S. to see the U.S. relationships with China and Japan separately, As one of his advisors said to me when I met him some weeks ago, China can't be the default of the U.S.-Japan alliance. So the Obama goal, I think, is to maintain sound but independent and separate relationships with both. The other key alliance relationship is with South Korea. After a period of tension during the tenure of leftist President Roh Moo-hyun, when South Korea pushed for greater engagement with North Korea and the U.S. objected, under the new South Korean President Lee Myung-bak, these differences have eased. That's left the Bush administration somewhat more in sync with Seoul on dealing with North Korea. But the two governments still have a lot of work to do to complete the reconfiguration of the U.S. military presence on the peninsula, and they must do so in the context of continuing and deep anti-American sentiment in South Korea. This sentiment was reflected in the intense emotional response to the issue of imports of U.S. beef this past spring, when there were large and sometimes violent demonstrations on the streets of South Korea. That's left the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, which the U.S. Congress was already dubious about passing, in further jeopardy. The Free Trade Agreement is important for the long-term health of both economies. It's projected to boost trade by $10 billion a year, and it's important also for putting the overall U.S.-South Korea relationship on a more solid footing for getting beyond just a security alliance created in the darkest days of the Cold War. Barack Obama has voiced some serious reservations about the free trade agreement, and so I think finding a way to move forward on that is really important to consolidating the U.S.-South Korea relationship in this new period. And also, in South Korea, as in Japan, there are some broader concerns, the same sense of U.S. weakness, the U.S. being distracted by Iraq and other problems, and of not paying enough attention to Asia. Which brings me to my next point. The Bush administration has generally viewed Asia through the lens of the war on terror, subordinating other issues of greater importance to the region to this overriding obsession. That's been reflected in episodes such as Condoleezza Rice becoming the first U.S. Secretary of State to skip the regional forum held every year of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, not once, but twice. More broadly, while many Asian nations are looking to develop a regional security architecture through such new institutions as the East Asian Summit and the Shanghai Cooperation Council, the U.S. has been frozen out. Washington has generally seemed to be uncomfortable with these multilateral efforts, focusing instead on bilateral relationships and alliances almost in a Cold War fashion, especially with Japan. The upshot, as one former State Department official observed to me, is that in many ways the U.S. has become increasingly isolated across the region at a crucial time. And this has coincided with the rise of China's soft power. I was reading an article some days ago which had some really striking statistics. The Philippines, which used to house U.S. military bases, gets 4 times as much aid today from China as from the United States. Twice as many Indonesians are studying in China as in America. And China has replaced the United States as the top trading partner for South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and a host of Southeast Asian nations. So even if all the difficulties that are in the way of a smooth U.S.-China relationship can be managed and that relationship kept on an even keel, the new administration is going to have a lot of work to do to keep U.S. ties with its key Asian allies on track and make the adjustments necessary for the U.S. to maintain its position in a rapidly changing region. Thanks very much.